Jack Sullivan, a 55-year-old veteran, sat quietly on a park bench, looking out at the hustle of the city that had become so different from the one he remembered. His weathered face bore the marks of a man who had seen too much, and yet his gaze was peaceful as he observed the day unfolding around him. The warmth of the sun on his face reminded him of a simpler time, a time before the war, before he returned home to a world that had moved on without him. He wasn't looking for attention, not anymore. Just a bit of peace in the middle of a crowded world. The park was filled with people, tourists strolling by, kids running around the fountain, couples sitting on benches, and the occasional jogger weaving through the crowd. It was a far cry from the chaos Jack had left behind in war. But here, in this park, things felt somewhat normal. He felt, for the first time in years, that maybe he could belong here. Hello, Mr. Pictures here. And before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. A young woman, her face buried in a smartphone, walked past Jack. Her steps were quick, her mind seemingly elsewhere as she glanced around the park, scanning for something, or perhaps someone. She didn't see Jack sitting on the bench, not until she bumped into him. "Excuse me," Jack said softly, moving his bag over slightly to give her room. The woman glanced down at him, a slight frown forming on her face. "Yeah, whatever," she muttered, clearly distracted, before hurrying away. Jack felt a pang of irritation, but it passed quickly. People had always been in a rush, and he'd learned to let it go. Jack settled back into his seat, his thoughts drifting to memories long buried. But before he could sink deeper into them, he noticed the same woman now walking back in his direction. She was carrying a plastic cup of iced tea, the condensation beating on the surface, and her expression was one of clear impatience. In her haste to pass by, she bumped into Jack again. This time, the iced tea splashed out of the cup and hit his jacket. He felt the cold liquid soak through his shirt, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the sun. The woman stopped in her tracks, looking down at the mess she had caused. Her eyes widened for a moment, then narrowed, her frustration clearly rising. "Oh, great," she muttered under her breath, looking from the spilled tea to Jack, who remained still, his face unreadable. "You couldn't have moved a little?" Jack didn't speak at first. He simply wiped the tea from his chest with the back of his hand, a calmness settling over him. "It's fine," he said, his voice even and unbothered. But the woman, still irritated, shot him an angry look. "It's not fine. You ruined my day. I'm late for something," she snapped. She stood there for a moment, clearly waiting for Jack to react, waiting for him to argue, to show anger. But Jack didn't rise to the occasion. Instead, he smiled faintly and said, "We all have our bad moments, don't we?" Without another word, Jack stood, brushing the rest of the tea from his jacket, and began to walk toward the park's restroom to clean up. But just as he turned away, he heard the woman muttering something under her breath. It was hard to make out, but Jack recognized the bitterness in her tone. As Jack made his way to the restroom, he felt the chill of the tea drying on his skin, his shirt clinging to him in an uncomfortable way. He didn't mind. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Life had a way of throwing small inconveniences in his path. He'd dealt with worse, much worse than a spilled drink from a frustrated tourist. But it was the way she'd looked at him, like he was an obstacle in her path, a man whose time was somehow less valuable than hers. It lingered in his mind as he entered the restroom and quickly washed off the residue of the tea. His reflection in the mirror looked as it always had, weathered, worn, but somehow still standing. When he emerged, the woman, Claire, was sitting on a bench near the restroom, her back to him. She was tapping away at her phone, oblivious to the world around her. Jack's instincts told him to just walk away, to leave it behind. But there was something about the way she carried herself that tugged at him. Maybe it was the same tired look in her eyes, the one he'd seen in his own reflection so many years ago, the one that came with a weariness that only life's battles could bring. Maybe she didn't mean to lash out at him. Maybe she was just dealing with her own burdens. Jack hesitated for a moment, then made his way back to the park bench where he'd been sitting earlier, sitting down once again, quietly this time. He wasn't expecting anything, but he wasn't going to let her walk away thinking she could treat him, or anyone else, like that without some kind of understanding. He had learned the hard way that communication was everything, both for healing and for growth. Claire's voice broke his thoughts. "Hey," she called, her tone softer now. "Look, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Jack looked up, meeting her gaze for the first time, and saw the sincerity in her eyes. It surprised him. She wasn't the angry, frustrated woman from before. This time, she seemed vulnerable, as if the weight of everything that had been going wrong in her life had caught up with her in that one small moment. "It's all right," Jack said, his voice calm. "It's just tea. Could have been worse." She gave him a tight smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Jack could tell she wasn't just apologizing for the tea anymore. There was something deeper, something more personal she wasn't saying. It was the way her fingers clenched around her phone, the way her shoulders slumped, like she was carrying something heavy. "I don't know what's wrong with me sometimes," Claire admitted, her voice low. "I'm just so... I don't know. I guess I've been running late for everything, and it just felt like the world was against me today. I shouldn't have taken it out on you." Jack nodded, giving her the space to speak. He didn't need to fill the silence. He had learned over the years that sometimes people just needed someone to listen. So, he did just that. He listened. "I can't seem to get things right," Claire continued. "Everything's a rush. I'm always trying to catch up, and I just feel like I'm failing at everything. At work, at home, with my friends. It's like I'm always behind, always stressed." She paused, her voice trailing off. "And when I saw you sitting there, I don't know why, but I got so angry. I felt like you were in my way, like you had all the time in the world, and I didn't." Jack leaned back on the bench, studying her for a moment. Her admission wasn't just an apology for the spill anymore. She was opening up about something far deeper. Jack knew that feeling all too well. Life, especially after everything he had been through, could feel like a never-ending race, with no finish line in sight. But it wasn't until you stopped running that you realized you'd already missed the beauty in everything around you. "You're not failing, Claire," Jack said softly. His voice wasn't the commanding tone he used when giving orders or when trying to put up a front. This was the voice of someone who had been there, someone who had spent years fighting battles both external and internal. "Sometimes it feels like you're stuck, I know, but it's not about rushing to get to the next thing. It's about finding peace with what you have right now." Claire blinked, looking at him as if she wasn't sure if she had heard him correctly. But Jack was patient. He had waited a lifetime to understand this truth. Maybe it was time someone else did too. "I didn't know what peace was for a long time," Jack continued. "Not until I came back from war. I thought peace was something that happened when everything was fixed. But it's not. Peace is something you find in yourself, in the little moments, the quiet ones, like sitting here, watching the world go by, knowing that it's okay to stop." Claire sat still for a moment, her eyes focused on Jack. She wasn't looking at him like he was just some old man on a bench anymore. She was listening to him, really hearing him. "I wish I could stop," she murmured, "but I feel like there's always something waiting for me, something I haven't done yet. A deadline I missed, a call I didn't make." Jack smiled, though it wasn't a smile of mockery. It was a smile of understanding. "You can't outrun everything, Claire. I spent years trying to outrun my own regrets, but you can't. They'll catch up to you, and when they do, you'll realize that all that rushing didn't change anything." She looked down at her hands for a moment, her fingers now relaxed. Then, slowly, she looked back at Jack. "I never really thought about it like that." Jack nodded. "Sometimes, the world tells us to keep going faster, to never stop. But you don't have to live by the world's rules. You get to decide your own pace." The words hung in the air between them, and Jack could see the weight lifting from Claire's shoulders. The tension in her body had eased, her face no longer tight with frustration. "I'm sorry about earlier," she said again, her voice quieter now, more sincere. "I didn't mean to take it out on you. You were just sitting there, minding your own business, and I acted like I owned the world." Jack chuckled softly, the sound like gravel in his chest. "We've all been there, kid. Don't worry about it. Sometimes we just need a reminder that things don't have to be perfect." For the first time that day, Claire's smile reached her eyes, and Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of peace himself. It wasn't about what had happened between them. It was about the understanding that, in this moment, they had both found something more valuable than anything else: clarity. Claire sat there for a moment longer, taking in Jack's words, letting them settle in her mind like ripples across a calm pond. For the first time in what felt like forever, she stopped thinking about the future, the deadlines, the endless race to be somewhere else. She just listened to Jack, to the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves, to the city breathing around them. It was something she hadn't allowed herself to do in a long time. She finally stood up, feeling lighter than when she had sat down. Her frustration, which had once boiled over, now felt like something distant, a memory she no longer needed to hold on to. "Thank you," Claire said, her voice quieter now. "I think I needed to hear that more than I realized." Jack gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "It's not about what I've been through, or what you've been through. We all have our own battles, but sometimes the hardest thing is slowing down enough to realize that you're not in them alone." Claire smiled, a genuine smile this time, one that seemed to soften the edges of the stress that had defined her day, maybe even her life. "I think I've spent too much time running," she said softly, more to herself than to Jack. "That's how the world wants you to feel," Jack replied, "but running from yourself doesn't get you anywhere." She nodded, taking a step back. The moment, the conversation, felt like a turning point, an unexpected but much needed one. As she started to walk away, Jack watched her, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. It wasn't a victory, it wasn't a conquest. It was just a connection, a fleeting moment in time where two people had found something they needed in each other. But as Claire walked further into the park, she stopped, her eyes catching something in the distance. Jack noticed it too. A young man, his hands fidgeting nervously at his sides, walking toward them. He was dressed in a hoodie and jeans, his eyes darting around as though he were unsure of what he was doing. But there was something about him, something familiar, something Jack couldn't place. The man walked up to Jack, standing awkwardly for a moment, shifting his weight from foot to foot. His gaze dropped to the ground before slowly meeting Jack's eyes. "Hey," he said quietly, almost hesitant. Jack raised an eyebrow. "Can I help you, son?" The young man shifted again, his hands now buried deep in his pockets. I don't know. I was just wondering." He paused, looking unsure, then took a deep breath. "If you had any advice." Jack studied him for a moment, sensing the unease. "Advice about what?" The man looked down at the ground again. "Everything," he muttered, the word barely audible. "Life, I guess. I'm not sure where I'm going anymore." Jack's eyes softened as he regarded the young man. The weight in his voice echoed with something Jack had felt before, a loss of direction, a sense of being adrift. He had heard this before, seen it in the faces of young soldiers who came back from war, unsure of what to do with their lives. "I can't tell you what to do," Jack said after a moment, his voice calm, "but I can tell you that you don't have to have it all figured out right now. Life isn't about having all the answers today. It's about making the right decisions when you can, and being patient with yourself when you don't." The man nodded, his eyes brightening a little, though the uncertainty still lingered. I guess I've been running from things too," he admitted quietly, as if the weight of the words shocked him. "I don't really know where to start anymore." Jack gave him a soft smile, a smile that spoke of wisdom and age. "Start with yourself. Don't worry about where you're headed. Just take it one step at a time." The man hesitated for a moment before offering a slight, grateful smile. "Thanks. I think I needed to hear that." As the young man walked away, Jack couldn't help but feel the ripple effects of the moment he had just witnessed. It wasn't just Claire who had needed a moment of clarity, it was the man, too. The same frustrations, the same confusion. It was a shared understanding that, for a brief time, had connected them. Claire had continued walking, but she paused as she saw Jack speaking to the young man. She turned back, curiosity piqued by what she was witnessing. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to see Jack as more than just the quiet veteran on the bench. But now she saw something else. A man who, despite the hardships he had faced, had the ability to reach out and help others who felt lost. She couldn't hear the words, but she could see it. She could see the connection, the way the young man's posture had softened, how he seemed to stand taller after speaking with Jack. She felt a quiet pride wash over her, an unexpected warmth, as if Jack had just shared a little piece of his wisdom with someone else in need. Maybe that's what it was all about, helping one another find the way when it felt impossible to see. When the young man left, Claire walked back toward Jack. She stopped a few paces away, unsure of what to say, but Jack glanced at her and smiled. "It's not about the big gestures," he said. "It's about those little moments, those quiet conversations that change something inside you." Claire nodded, her eyes glistening with unspoken gratitude. "You've got a lot of wisdom for a guy who just had teeth thrown at him," she said, a soft laugh escaping her lips. Jack chuckled, the sound easy and light. "You'd be surprised how many lessons can be learned from a cup of tea, but you don't have to be a hero to make a difference." "Maybe not," Claire said thoughtfully, her gaze lingering on Jack for a moment longer. "But you're definitely making a difference." Jack looked out over the park once more, the crowd still bustling, but now with a different sense of purpose. Maybe he hadn't been just sitting there after all. Maybe, in the grand scheme of things, these small moments had more impact than anyone could see. He wasn't sure what had led him here, or why Claire had come into his life for just this brief moment. But it didn't matter. It was enough that today, in this park, they had shared something real. As Claire turned to walk away, Jack stood up slowly, stretching his legs, and watched her leave, the quiet hum of the world around him settling into a peaceful calm. This wasn't the end. It was just another beginning. Jack had always been good at reading people. It was one of the things the Army had taught him: how to assess, how to predict, how to understand without words. And as he watched Claire disappear into the crowd, he felt something shift within him. It wasn't just a passing conversation, a chance encounter. There was a ripple that had been set into motion, something that would continue to move forward long after she had walked away. He didn't know why, but something about her had reminded him of himself years ago. So lost, so caught up in trying to outrun everything he didn't want to face. Jack hadn't had anyone to tell him what he'd just told Claire. No one had stopped him in his tracks long enough for him to realize that all the things he thought he had to fix were the things he needed to come to terms with, slowly and in time. Claire was running from herself. Jack had seen it before, but the truth was they all were. Running, hiding, pretending they could outrun what they didn't want to face. It wasn't just Claire, and it wasn't just him. It was the world. The more you ran, the further you got from the peace you could have had. He could see it in her, the same signs he'd seen in others who had felt the weight of living in a fast-paced world. Jack had tried to outrun his demons. After the war, after everything, he had thought that if he could just stay busy, keep moving, keep going, he wouldn't have to look back at what had broken him. But it didn't work. The past always came back, and when it did, it found you no matter how far you tried to run. It wasn't until years later, after so many sleepless nights, after so much loneliness, that he had finally figured it out. Peace wasn't something you found by running. It was something you made peace with inside. You had to stop and face it head on. Jack turned his attention back to the park, to the crowd of people who continued to move about their day. They were all caught in the same hustle, each of them dealing with their own version of stress, of unmet expectations, of frustrations they couldn't always articulate. He could see it in their eyes, just like he had seen it in Claire's, the rush, the constant push to get ahead, the weight of not knowing how to slow down. Jack took a deep breath, letting the calm of the park wash over him. There was something peaceful about the steady rhythm of life moving forward around him. He wasn't in a race anymore. He didn't have to try so hard. The world could move at its own pace, and Jack was content to just sit and watch it unfold. But even in the calm, he knew there was more to be done. He hadn't just given Claire advice for the moment. He had given her something far more important. Permission. Permission to stop running. Permission to breathe. Permission to find peace. That was the power of connection, Jack thought. Not just for Claire, but for him too. The truth he had learned was simple, but hard to grasp. Life wasn't about fixing everything or making everything go according to plan. It was about being okay with not having all the answers, about embracing the brokenness and finding peace in the struggle. A few days later, Jack found himself back in the park, the same bench where Claire had spilled her tea, and where he had found the courage to speak his truth. The world was busy, as it always was. But something had changed. Jack didn't feel so out of place anymore. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel, as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. He saw Claire again, walking down the same path. She was alone this time. No rushing, no head buried in a phone. Her steps were slower, more deliberate. She looked at peace with herself, as if she had taken a moment to stop chasing after the things she couldn't control. When she spotted Jack, she stopped for a moment, her eyes meeting his. A soft smile appeared on her face. Jack smiled back, but he didn't get up. He didn't need to. She walked over to him, her pace calm, but now purposeful. "Hi," Claire greeted him, her voice no longer filled with the same tension it had carried the first time. She seemed different. There was something softer in her eyes, something lighter in her step. "Hey, Claire," Jack replied, his voice warm but steady. He didn't feel the need to say anything else. There was no rush to fill the space between them with words. It was like they had both already said everything that needed to be said. She sat down next to him on the bench, a comfortable silence between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke, but the world around them didn't feel quite so fast. Claire wasn't looking around for the next thing, and Jack wasn't looking to the horizon for answers. They were both just there, existing in the moment. "You were right," Claire said after a long pause, her voice thoughtful. "About slowing down, about not running from everything. I've been so caught up in trying to fix everything, trying to meet other people's expectations. I didn't even know who I was anymore." Jack nodded slowly, his gaze still on the park. "You don't have to fix anything, Claire. Sometimes the hardest part is accepting things the way they are, the way you are." She looked at him, her eyes glistening with understanding. "I don't know if I can always do it, but I'm going to try. I've spent so much time being angry at everything, at life, at myself. But you made me see that I don't have to keep pushing. I can just be." Jack smiled at her, the kind of smile that came from somewhere deep inside. It wasn't about her apologizing for the tea. It wasn't about some grand revelation. It was about both of them realizing that they didn't have to chase perfection or avoid pain. They just had to be present, to be honest, to move forward slowly when everything else pushed them to go faster. "I'm glad you're starting to see that," Jack said quietly. "It's not easy, but it's worth it. Every step forward, even if it's small." They sat there in quiet companionship for a while longer, the world moving around them, but for just a few moments they didn't need to move with it. They were there, together, and that was enough. As they got up to leave, Claire paused, her gaze lingering on Jack once more. "Thank you," she said sincerely, "for everything." Jack nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "You're welcome, Claire. Take care of yourself." And with that, they parted ways, two people whose lives had briefly intersected, but whose lives would carry on, shaped in small ways by the moments they had shared. The ripple had begun, and somewhere in that park, life continued, a little slower, a little more peaceful, one person at a time. The days after Jack's conversation with Claire felt different, slower, more deliberate, like the world had shifted just enough to let in a breath of fresh air. Jack kept his usual routine, sitting on the park bench, watching the world go by, but now each moment felt heavier with meaning. It was as if the small interactions, the fleeting encounters, held more weight than he had ever given them credit for. He hadn't seen Claire for a few days, but that didn't bother him. He didn't need to see her every day, and neither did she. But something in the back of his mind told him that her life was moving in a different direction now, and that was enough. The work she had to do wasn't finished. It would never be finished, not for any of them. But she had started to understand that the real victories weren't found in deadlines or perfect plans. They were in the quiet moments, the ones that changed something inside of you, without you even realizing it. The park was busier than usual today. Jack watched the usual crowd of people moving around him, the joggers, the tourists, the families, all lost in their own worlds. He didn't mind. He had learned to be at peace with the ebb and flow of the world around him, not trying to control or influence it, but to simply be part of it. It was then that he saw her again, Claire, walking toward him. She was carrying a cup of coffee, but this time she wasn't rushing. She wasn't distracted by her phone or looking over her shoulder. She was just walking, her pace measured, her steps steady. When she saw him, she smiled, a real smile this time, and walked over to where Jack was sitting. "Hey," she greeted him softly, a warmth in her voice that hadn't been there before. Jack smiled back. "Hey, Claire, how's it going?" She sat down next to him, taking a slow sip of her coffee before answering. "It's going better than I thought it would, actually," she said, with a hint of relief in her voice. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. about slowing down, about not always running toward the next thing. It's been hard, but it's been worth it. Jack nodded. It's not easy, but it's worth the effort. The world doesn't always have to move at the speed it wants to. Sometimes you've got to take your own pace. Claire looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as though looking for something. Maybe she was searching for something she hadn't realized she'd been missing. I didn't know I could do it. I didn't know how to take a break without feeling guilty about it. But I'm starting to see that it's okay. It's okay to just be. Jack's expression softened. Yeah, it is. It doesn't have to be a race. You don't have to measure your life by how fast you're moving or by how much you can fit in. It's the little things that matter. They sat there in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the world go by. Jack could feel the change in her, in the way she sat with him, in the way she looked at life now. She wasn't rushing, wasn't frantically searching for something that would make her feel complete. She had found something already, something inside herself. And that was enough. Eventually, Claire spoke again, her voice quieter now, almost as if she were speaking to herself. I think the reason I've been so frantic is because I'm scared. Scared of not living up to expectations, scared of disappointing people. But more than that, I've been scared of disappointing myself. Jack looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he saw the full weight of her struggle, the internal battle she had been fighting all along. It wasn't just about the tea or the impatience. It was about the fear of never feeling good enough, of always being on the outside looking in. I get that, Jack said, his voice quiet but firm. We all have that fear. I had it too, for a long time. I thought I had to be someone else, be more than I was, just to prove I was worth something. But when you stop fighting so hard to be something you're not, you find that what you are is enough. Claire's eyes softened, and she exhaled deeply, as if releasing a burden she had been carrying for too long. You've been through a lot, haven't you? Jack smiled gently, the memories of his past fading into something that no longer defined him. We all have, but it doesn't have to break us. We just have to find our own way through. I wish I had figured it out sooner, Claire said, her voice filled with quiet regret. You figured it out when you were ready, Jack replied, his words steady, but filled with a wisdom that came from years of learning the hard way. There's no too late in life. You get there when you get there. Claire smiled again, this time with a sense of peace that Jack hadn't seen before. It was the smile of someone who had found something within themselves, something that wasn't about doing or achieving, but about simply being. She didn't need to fix everything. She didn't need to rush. She just needed to be present. As they sat together, the world around them continued at its usual pace. The people in the park went about their day, lost in their own lives. But for Jack and Claire, time felt different. It wasn't a race. It wasn't a countdown. It was just life, unfolding slowly, one moment at a time. You know, Claire said, breaking the silence once more, I've been thinking about what I want to do next. Not in terms of a career or something to prove, but something that feels right. Something that feels like me. Jack raised an eyebrow, a small smile tugging at his lips. That sounds like a good start. It is, Claire said, her eyes brightening. It's not a grand plan or a quick fix. It's just about being true to myself. I think I can do that now. Jack nodded, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He had said his piece, but Claire's words had given him something too. She was learning the same lessons he had to learn the hard way. And now, maybe she would find the peace he had searched for so long. The kind of peace that comes not from conquering the world, but from understanding it, from embracing it. And as Claire stood up, ready to take on the world in her own way, Jack knew that their paths had crossed for a reason. Their conversation, their shared moment, had been one of those quiet victories. Moments that change something inside you without you even realizing it. As she walked away, Jack felt that familiar calm settle over him again. Life, with all its complexities, had a way of unfolding in its own time. He had learned that much. And now, with Claire walking away, a little lighter, a little freer, he knew that maybe, just maybe, this world wasn't as chaotic as it seemed. Maybe there was hope after all.